Following Jerry's talk, he'll be joined by four panelists who are all SFU students, Natalie Knight, Didier Morelli, Andrea Creamer, and Nicholas Perrin, and I'll give a fuller introduction to them following Jerry's talk. It's a really great honor to have Jerry with us this evening. Last week we had a talk by Bob Williams, who's 80 years old, and in comparison to him, Jerry's just a young whippersnapper. Jerry was part of the founding faculty at SFU in 1965. He's currently the Simons Chair at Graduate Liberal Studies at SFU and formerly the founding director of the Institute for the Humanities. I ask you to join me in welcoming Jerry Zaslove.
Thanks, Am, and thank you for coming out to listen to this talk. I'm going to try to. I have a lot of material, but as usual. But I'm going to try to not use it all, so we can have commentary from our friends. It's true what Am says, that I've been around a long time, and I've written about the university and academic freedom and been part of it for such a long time, that when I was reading this working paper that I'm trying to put into a book, I began to think that after all these years reading about Simon Fraser in the past, I'm starting to believe what I'm writing. And I thought that's a sign of old age or nostalgia. Before I begin, let me just put three themes on the table that I want to weave in and out of my conversation with you today. One is about public intellectuals. The second is about the ambiguous fiction of SFU as a utopic and radical historical reality, as a project that may have failed. We don't know yet, but that's part of my theme. The third is human rights as a working out of the unfinished project of the student's role in the critique of the university as the high point of bourgeois culture, cultural capital. I'm going to begin in a few minutes, not with Herbert Marcuse, whose letter here you're reading, or other public intellectuals, but I'm going to begin with a statement by a public intellectual, the former president of Simon Fraser, Michael Stevenson. I'm going to be primarily doing a cultural history. I do not go into the economic history of the university. That's part of the real estate history, the corporate giveaways. I'm going to leave that to the future of the school of Jeff Dirksen, who will do it better than I can. But that's the world of the marathon development, land and development, Dayon, Bentall, Trezex, waterfront development of costly housing, and housing that could be called in the urban core Manhattanism, or what I like to call Goliathism, or following Bruegel, the big fish eating little fish. Unfortunately, if you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you see one of my themes is schooling, and you'll see the old professor pointing out to the young student what's going on as big fish eat little fish. Is one of the great anti-feudal, anti-capitalist images that we have. But the Goliathism that I call that is based on fast growth, migration of people into the area, the need for pools of labor, interlocking ownership of holding companies, banks, railroads, shipping, newspapers, TV, and communication industry. So these are the areas that lie behind what I'm saying. But today I'm going to talk mainly about cultural history. The letter from Herbert Marcuse to me was a bit of a fluke, not really, because I had done a dissertation that was involved with him. And Herbert Marcuse came here in 1967, was invited by the Political Science, Sociology, Anthropology Department to speak. And he spoke to large crowds in the, not there, but He spoke to large crowds, which I'll show you in a little bit, at the in the lecture theaters that was doubled over. You had to go into, you had 2 lecture theaters to listen to him. I don't suppose that the large crowds would bring a university professor a university president into view. But let me begin with Michael Stevenson's review of a book called Leadership Under Fire, The Challenging Role of the Canadian University President. And he's referring to the author Ross Paul's account of the changings and underlying tensions in Canadian university life touches all the obvious but vitally important issues. So he's reviewing, I'm quoting him, the pressure for growth and accessibility coupled to declining real per capita grant funding for enrollment, the anonymity, bureaucratization, managerialism that size, complexity, and unsustainable financing entail, the increasingly instrumental interests of government and business in the university's contribution to labor supply. I mean, I didn't write this, right? And the pressures of external and internal stakeholders for transparency and accountability in the uses of public money. Add to these the tensions around academic freedom, produced by the increasing social diversity of the academic community and by the increasing corporatization of the university. The undermining of collegial relations and the souring of labor relations in such an environment, the never-ending demand for and cost for new technologies, the demands for institutional differentiation, internal structural, I mean, this is president speak, right? Internal structural adjustment and retrenchment, and the pressures to increase tuition fees, research overheads, and external fundraising, and the increasingly competitive environment for such funding. Now, strikes me here about this analysis question is, as a public intellectual, does he tell the public this, or does it buried in an obscure review in a CAUT journal? Raises the question about what is a public intellectual. But what is interesting about that comment, that review of his, is he doesn't mention students. He doesn't mention the labor force, except obliquely. He doesn't mention TAs. He doesn't mention much about the pressures on intellectual life that comes by living in a modern university. So briefly, what is a public intellectual? Him or Marcuse? Why is the question important, and what does it have to do with academic freedom? It has to do with the carrying out, the extension, the stretching of the social and ethics and morality of academic freedom into the world that may or not like to hear criticism from those who have been trained to understand power and to criticize power and authority when it cannot be reformed for the public good. One of my themes is the loss of the public in terms of the modern university, or the attempt to reach the public is a better way to put it, and the public constantly retreating from that dialogue because of what I'm calling conflicting publics. I'll mention that in a few minutes. In a world of performance indicators and the money economy dictating the organization of the university's resources, knowledge is resource that becomes commodities when understood as property, and that the control of property is the new universal exchange, the new world order which came at the end of the Cold War, when intellectuals on both sides of the border were watched and their political values became enemy values. The wave of prosperity that found a home in the 60s, after the Second World War, became a home in the 90s again, when the Third World and even Second World actors and the immigration movements that came into Vancouver after the 70s began to change the landscape of the urban. For a long time, no one mentioned race. But the signs are there, although this is an open university frightened by its own freedom. I think that's one of the insights that one can draw from his comment. It's frightened about its role in the public sphere. It cannot afford to offend public intellectuals, like, for example, the David Noble case that happened at the beginning of the 2000s, who was denied an appointment exactly because he is a public intellectual. Not only what he said, but he was saying it in public, however rightly or wrongly his opinions were assessed. It is not only what he said, or what his research was, or what its implication was for the use in the community, or for teaching. It is because he did not remain silent. It is because he left academia he treated academia as a calling in Max Weber's sense. That is, he performed rightly or wrongly the drama of speaking to power. In an age when, and this is what in an age when teaching is assigned to part-time faculty, usually graduate students, when the average term for, this is ironic, was for college presidents was not long ago 3.9 years, not as long as undergraduates. Downsizing somewhere, emergency planning elsewhere, expanding into the suburbs where the property is purchasable, while humanities grads decline as a proportion of all undergraduate degrees. These are figures that from the 90s. I'm not sure what they are now. And what has or did increase by 5 or 10-fold was in the U.S. computer and information services, protective surveillance services, transportation. By 1994, business held a 4-fold advantage over English. In 1971, 78% more degrees were granted in business than in English. On the preliminary scholastic aptitude test, 9% indicated an interest in English. The lowest salaries are in the humanities, and there are no consulting fees. Secondary jobs, outside incomes. Teaching loads are high for sessionals. The universities are in a perpetual crisis, actually, and they are in a state of denial. The proletarianization of the cadre of what I call brain workers, as distinct from intellectuals, is an inevitable result of the situation that one does not rock the boat or come to conferences run by students because there's no interest in it for one's CVs. The promise of money. A knowledge of money, studying it, a source for money, for grants, research, for increasing the capacity of the university to adapt to the money culture is a booming industry, if the size of administrative middle management is any indication. One does not draw attention to oneself in public except by doing what is required. The public intellectual is public not because he or she speaks in public, but because the intellectual challenges the power, the national identity that determines one's fate. What is not understood about the 60s, and I'm using this in a broad sense, I actually am a child of the 50s who came into the 60s through the side door, not the front door. What is not understood about the 60s is that although the counterculture was the rhetorical and ideological expression of a transition from one stage of the welfare state to another, played out in education, music, literature, the bearers of this transitional page were not pure public intellectuals on the way to national power, but critics of the system of power. It was a Canadian movement as well as an international one, because it was a Canadian movement as well as an international one because it spoke of rights, and new Canadian institutions were on the agenda. Simon Fraser being one of those new Canadian institutions. What you will find here, what interests me, is the mimicry, speaking aesthetically, of how the architecture at Simon Fraser. I'm sorry, it's blown up so good you can't see it very clearly. But the architecture of Simon Fraser, recreating the illusion of Roman and Greek pantheons. And what is, of course, wonderful about this picture, like the Bruegel picture, is down in the right-hand corner. You have the lonely artist trying to represent the field of forces of the historical project of the university. But this is the kind of, since I'm talking about schooling, and schooling against power and for power, and schooling was very much a part of the Simon Fraser revolution, so-called, of students, teaching assistants who participated in a strike at a local high school, Templeton High School, and were immediately deprived of their position by President McTaggart Cowan. That's not the Templeton High School. I happen to have been with Tom Bottomore, the well-known Marxian who was chair of the department, head of the department of PSA at the time, was on a university ethics committee listening to the cause for dismissal of these TAs. So I thought you'd like to see a kind of school that you and I went to, Some of these are my own pictures of schools. This is an interesting picture of Sandinista children learning, whether they're learning about the revolution or whether they're learning about playing the revolution, or what it is that they're learning, I don't know. But I like the picture because of the way in which they are looking and being part of a carnivalesque scene. Here's another picture of a school that's one of my favorite schooling pictures. It's very difficult Paul Goodman, who I'll refer to in a little while, he called a school as a box with the seats facing forward. And this is a wonderful representation and depiction of that. But if you look in the back, it might be, I'm not quite sure what this is doing. At first I thought it was a mirror showing, but now I know it's not a mirror, but it's showing the teacher in the back with another class, I think. So it must be a double class. This is a school, Lonsdale school, that's some pictures of mine, that in the process of being torn down. And now it's been replaced by actually an art and school for disabilities in the modernist architecture. Here's a rally on the Simon Fraser Mall, where some anarchist wag put up or fascist wag, I don't know which, put up a Nazi swastika. And here's Herbert Marcuse speaking to the masses at Simon Fraser. So let me continue with my prepared statement comments. What was going on at the time in the 60s? The market model university had not yet arrived. The utilitarian nature of the social agenda that always defined universities, social and cultural capital, was on the agenda in British Columbia, especially in an urban university, a new urban university in Vancouver. The utilitarian function of the university in a marketplace economy and the inevitable decline of global feudalism inspired the modernization of universities in British Columbia in the post-colonial period. In regard to the university, human or the subject of the individual, in Kantian terms, the goal was the autonomous individual, the educated individual. Here's a picture of Walter Benjamin's class with Gustav Winnekin, who was a free-thinking, free school kind of guy, precursor of the Summerhill movement, which was very active in the 1960s, the alternative school movement. Benjamin is down at the bottom there, but we don't see him in this picture. That's that school with the monster tree that is now torn down, and the tree is still there. The basic foundation of the colonial Kantian, Arnoldian trajectory of education was tutelage as the basic foundation of student and professorial consensus. Habermas, following Humboldt and others, including the great Kant, assumed that the state will become the ground, the mediator, and patron of a cultural nation based on the autonomous individual. The state in culture and science became the utopian heart of a knowledge that is both permanent and future-oriented, that is not now and will never compete not now and will ever finish the unfinished project of the Enlightenment. The apolitical project, however, that emerged in the 60s, I'm talking about the colonial educational project on the one hand, is the defensive aspect of it in order to build a professional administration and practice that would not jeopardize the primary function of the autonomous individual. To serve in ultimately the culture of the state culture, the unity of teaching and research, but the primary value is research, not teaching, which was typically embedded in an authoritarian form of the bourgeois project, namely cultural integration, socialization, and tradition were paramount in creating cultural and social capital. That's the background, if you might want to look at it that way, as the ideological shadow that fell over the older universities in Canada until Simon Fraser came on the scene with its modernist rationality. Without the university that emerged both in Europe and England and the Americas was full of these countervailing and difficult contradictions that when the market society and the training institutions collided, intellectuals versus brain workers. The decline of the inner-directed university needs to be traced, and the legacy of this rise and decline needs to be understood, in my view, as the struggle of social and cultural capital with the ideological and instrumental nature both of academic freedom on the one hand and the social demands of accountability and legitimation on the other. President, what's his name? Stevenson. On the one hand, the inwardness of the culture-protected mandarins of the professoriate. On the other hand, the expectation. In other words, what I'm saying is we as academics are privileged. We're mandarins in an ideal sense. Of the society that these mandarins would be apolitical, internally autonomous, and full of the educational neo-humanism of its literature and philosophical faculties. Within this struggle, however, there was another inner logic and an incommensurable warm stream of anarcho-communal and sometimes Marxist utopic understanding that was founded on the heretical, dissident, critical potential embedded in the subject matter that we were teaching. Its experiential, incommensurable, unmeasurable, non-normative, and open to interpretive values, including the modernist poetry that Steve mentioned, the hermeneutical sciences evolved officially in the early period of these intellectual movements, and they became the next great movement, the Foucaults and so forth and so on. Now, my next point is which were the movements influenced by the frequency of the connection of this knowledge of social movements and so-called revolutionary forces. The reform movements that came after the 60s were in literacy, criticism of the instrumental economy, cross-cultural and intercultural forces and women's movements that emerged in the 1970s and 80s, the rise of new genres and the elimination of the forces of colonization as the shadow that followed the rise of universities, that under the rubric of tutelage brought the colonized and the merchants and managers outside and inside into conflict with the missionary, coercive, and military powers of the cultural state. Now, what I'm saying is that internal to the universities were internal contradictions, where the brain workers, the management, the administration, that represented one aspect of the history of the Canadian universities, a very long aspect, and the other aspect was the lecture hall, the seminar, the learning space, the tutelage model, and the form of cooperative learning that was experimental and not just personnel-based and hierarchically organized. The walls of the university, in other words, was a microcosm of the society, of social utopia, free and equal citizens who were bound together by an oath of objectivity, competence that was unthreatened by adversaries from without, that is to say, academic freedom. We made our own rules, and we would have the security of tenure that carried with it certain responsibilities of self-government and obligation to objectivity that were preconditions for our work. That is, intellectual work was no longer to be confused with manual labor. That's a very important point. But intellectual labor was a rights-based, human rights-based kind of labor that was living labor that required us to turn to the public sphere and join with social movements on the outside. So what were some of the influences in that 60s period? Military-industrial complex, but was then known very well by Canadians and Americans. That was the term used by Dwight Eisenhower in 1956. The Vietnam War, Quebec separatism, mass education, and the founding of new colleges and universities. This is a shot from Metropolis, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Quebec separatism, mass counterculture outside of the university as an agent of change. Paris, 1968. The organization man, all of these themes influencing the movements in the 1960s. The open border, McLuhanism, Trudeauism, urban modernism, the Kennedy assassination, the rise of an anarcho-Marxist anti-traditional labor movement among student groups, new coalitions outside and within anti-establishmentarian values in the universities that looked for further reform of the new universities, and the older ones whose disciplinary arrangements seemed to be outdated. Frankfurt School was coming on the scene. Roland Barthes, Godard, Black Mountain poetry gave wit, playfulness, and a demonic quality to the most serious attempts to challenge the entrenched. In some way, what I'm saying is that we had this double aura of the university performing itself in public, and it was a public movement. That in some ways, corporate ownership of banks, transportation, mining, newspapers, and of course, behind all this, the cultural memory of smaller colonial nations like Canada, were faced with the growing hegemony of large states, the rebuilding of Europe, which formed, by the way, the British new universities, China and Russian expansionism, and the Cold War as the ultimate arbiter of political change. Colonial expansion continued, and the racialization of the cities of America determined the way in which one thought of urban and municipal politics. All this was on the agenda either implicitly or explicitly in the 1960s already. In other words, the fate of the community in exile. The Liberal Humanist Alliance that marked the Diefenbaker, Pearson, Trudeau, Stanfield, Tommy Douglas, and the CCF, NDP, and the UN Declaration of Human Rights were part of the shadow reality that I'm calling naming the interest in not only human rights but academic freedom. We've got a few more minutes. The key events in that period of time. The key events in that period of time were the dialectics of complicity and accommodation, and the accommodation to violence, and the beginning of an image of globalization as a political form of modern society. This is Angela Davis, a poster that just came in the mail a few weeks ago, who was a student of Marcuse's, and she's still talking about the old days. The violence that underscored the contradictions of commodity capitalism and wage labor and the ensuing revolution of globalization. What was called a traumatic war neurosis might now be called an unending war neurosis that leads to cynicism, despair, and violence at the thought of a life of unending accommodation and complicity. At the Dialectic of Liberation Conference in London in 1967, Stokely Carmichael, Ginsberg, Marcuse, Paul Goodman were attending along with her. The 50s McCarthyism was in the background in America and also in Canada, the expansion of the U.S. empire in Latin America. So I'm filling in the background that was so important in that period. The realization of the role of technology and violence and the atrophy of utopian socialism. The Oppenheimer trials, the Rosenberg trials, Alger Hiss, the Korean War, the growth of the atomic bomb, Cold War, and the Canadian complicity in building the bomb, which we heard about from John O'Brien, the art historian at UBC, who's written a book about that. The wildcat strikes in Detroit, labor union accommodation, and the utopic wish for a student and labor collaboration. The underground anarchism that saw unions against revolution, Daniel Bell's work, its discontinuance, and the study of men on the assembly line, and Harvey Suedo's The Myth of the Happy Worker, which I've adapted for my talk, The Myth of the Happy University. The complicity of American industry in fascist realms during the war, which was coming out in the 50s and 60s. What was behind the SDS movement and its parallels, and the silence of Hollywood and the media that implicated itself as socializing agents after World War I. Figures that were on the scene and were taught, even though they were taught somewhat surreptitiously in some of our programs, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, Stanley Milgram, Chomsky, Goodman, Psychoanalysis with a Human Face, Erich Fromm, Norman O'Brien. These are names that some of you will remember, but most of these books are not really taught regularly now. The Free School Movement in Canada, this magazine is about schools. Liberation magazine, Wilhelm Reich and Class Consciousness and Sexual Free Thinking, the anti-psychiatry movements, and so forth. The existential turn of Sartre and others around phenomenological, experiential friendliness toward maladies of the mind, and of course later showed up in the work of R.D. Laing and Cooper, and feminism trails this social and cultural movements. Okay, are you with me a little bit on this? Is this interesting? I don't know. Translations. Translations of Bertolt Brecht, the films of Godard, the Students for a Democratic Society, the formation and the struggle internal to the Students for the Democratic Society with the Weatherman movement. And recently, of course, in the last 8 or 9 years, I think, maybe more recently, we've had the autobiographies of the men, and including Bernadette Dorn, who is a law professor now, that have come out, that is rehearsing those 60s and trying to come to terms with their own role in them. What one could conclude maybe about that is that at that point, revolution, whether it was cultural revolution, political or not, seemed to be, in retrospect, a moral choice, an ethical choice, not a strategic plan, not something that would align itself with. And this is a, I don't know whether the name Carl Oglesby is familiar with you. He became a folk singer, went to Vietnam, and wrote a book about it. And actually, in the 1950s, he was a close friend of mine, and we sat on back porches in small towns in Ohio talking about these kinds of things. And I went off somewhere else, and he went off to see Ezra Pound in Washington. And that, I don't know what effect it had on him. But what I want to talk about here now in this part of the talk is again tracing the lines of cultural history, that the 1960s were a cultural war by other means. And the question is, did the 1960s, as a movement, as a period, as a historical concept, does it produce continuity with protest traditions now? One of the generational dyslexic aspects of thinking back is that the political conditions in the 1960s for hundreds of thousands of people now who live in 10 cities or are crossing borders as we speak, who are the subject of surveillance, policing, stamping, immigration, residency requirements that have changed drastically since the Vietnam War. At that time, it was easy to come to Canada. The characters, for example, in Pulp Fiction, the Deer Hunter or the Great Lebowski, whose brutality conditioned by wars in Asia, far from America or Canada, do not think about flight, refuge, asylum, exile, or resettlement in a foreign country like Canada. They tough it out. In The Great Lebowski, as well as Pulp Fiction, we are watching losers in the Mayo con game, con artists, drifters, crypto-fascists, or dropouts whose relationship to protest has been broken by forces that do not have a political name, but function nevertheless as an effect of American or maverick American movements. The United States at that time witnessed an exodus like the flight, exile, refuge, sanctuary, asylum, and ultimately citizenship or landed immigrant status of Americans who left because of the war. If one doesn't understand that, one doesn't understand the ferment that was going on at the time. This included deserters, draft dodgers, expatriates. Most knew it was against the law and they would be prosecuted. The morality of the war, patriotism, political innocence, and in some cases political understanding were the motives. Sheer fear, another. Amnesty or pardon, not in view given the tenor of the times. The fugitives came from many different backgrounds, although one could say they were mainly middle class. Some were well educated, some were dropouts, some were variously employed. Not since pre-revolutionary times, when 80,000 Tories fled from the Revolutionary War, or one might say since the Civil War, when underground railroads led the black slaves north, was there such an exodus or transmigration. So one of the themes here is the on the historical stage was this question of exile, transmigration, as it is now. The figures vary from 60,000 to 100,000 American draft evaders. There were many Canadian civil society human rights organizations who helped, counselors in many cities and border towns. These organizations were monitored by the FBI, police, and CSIS, but it was a truly mutual aid, anarcho-communitarian network of peoples and groups. The border guards checked the National Crime Information Center. The Bellingham Draft Board was very active. Many Americans, 10,000, stayed underground. Their choice was Sweden or Canada. I haven't done research about Mexico. The poets probably went to Mexico. When Canada was at war, 1939 to 1941, Canadian deserters were welcomed in the U.S. But then another kind of exodus was the brain drain. That was part of the whole drama of the time, worried that Simon Fraser would become an American or a British or a university and not truly Canadian. It was a very tormented time around that question of national identity. The folklore at the time was that Canada welcomed foreigners into a racialized society. The Japanese internment was hardly known. Also, the prisoner of war culture of Germans, Italians, and Ukrainians. The colonial society with deep roots in British jurisprudence. I'm going to try to come to an end here. And French-Canadian universalism was based on a Catholic worldview, Trudeauism, Montrealism, and the socialization that where Trudeau followed Lester Pearson's liberalism, but not the Ed Broadbent NDP kind of social democracy. The point system, in order to migrate, come to Canada, there was a point system. Less educated and lower skilled had problems, but you could marry a Canadian citizen, and a lot of draft evaders married Canadian women. In 1972, there was a 90-day amnesty for illegal immigrants. 1,200 signed up for residency. In Sweden, the refugees had international status as international refugees. According to one study, most of the 210,000 named and accused draft resistors remained home and faced the law. 1/6 hid, maybe. Maurice Udall, the Secretary of the Interior, and the great, memorable Spiro Agnew, who was what's his name? The man whose arms waved, Nixon's, had nephews. Spiro Agnew had nephews in exile. Nixon took a moral position that it was treason before changing his mind as the body bags started to come in from Vietnam. Nixon aides, particularly Pat Buchanan, labeled them the worst of the generation. Malingerers, opportunists, criminals, cowards, victims of character deficiency, in other words, psychopathological profile. Malcontents, radicals, incendiaries, civil disobedience, hippies, yahoos, Black Panthers, lions, tigers. I would smack. These are the wild rhetoric of Spiro Agnew, and he says I would swap the whole damn do for a single platoon of the kind of young Americans I saw in Vietnam. Well, the reason this is laughable now, but not so laughable, is that it was a conflicted public sphere here too. The press looked at these draft dodgers and the people at the students at Simon Fraser in a cynical way. In the summer of 1967, July 15th to July 30th, a Dialectics of Liberation Congress that I mentioned was organized by Drs. Joseph Burke, David Cooper, R.D. Lang, Leon Redler of the Institute of Phenomenological Studies in London. This gathering of psychiatrists, or what you might call utopic pedagogues, represented all parts of the world, including Cuba, Vietnam, Nigeria, the Julian Beck of the Living Theater, Allen Ginsberg, Emmett Grogan of the Diggers, and contingents from the new experimental schools and colleges. The pantheon also lies deep in the foliage and ruins of the time. Other names who were at the that Congress were Marcuse, Carmichael, Goodman, Bateson, and others. The point of this. On the agenda was class analysis, the critique of schooling, and the assumption that this Congress could be part of a coming radical pedagogy. Although the absence of women in the Congress would be noticed immediately, soon the turn in the 70s to professions and academic recharging of the batteries, which would be the whitewashing of the 60s by Simon Fraser's administration throughout the 70s and 80s. By now it's in a memory hole, or it can be trotted out, as a kind of sign of memorabilia. Soon the turn in the 70s to professions and academic recharging of the batteries of the institution would turn the classroom into a very veritable training ground for careers. One of my themes here is that the revolution, educational, pedagogic, didactic revolution, was carried on in the classroom. And a lot of the literature of the time, which I won't mention to you, was not about the market model university, but what you could do in the classroom. Against this background, the university transformed itself. I'm coming to the end. Migration, immigration, diaspora, the Vietnamization of the urban world of draft and war resistors, the emergence at this time, and if you look at the architectural history of Vancouver from the 1950s to the 1960s, is challenge the art, begin to emerge with a cosmopolitan modernist architecture, for example, that challenged the modernism of establishment Canada. This came through new artistic movements, a residual nostalgia for the social democratic and liberal humanist alliance that marked the Diefenbaker, Pearson, Trudeau, and Stanfield era that embodied the welfare state in the anticipation of the future of a resource and colonial-based economy. So what I'm saying is, and I know others in the room here have also written about this, that the modernist architecture that we see mirroring outside, and I don't have this on my slides now, is the history of the destruction of the old Vancouver in the name of what I'm calling the liberal humanist alliances that is reflected in the architecture. Like a natural history of destruction, this conservative era has disappeared as a norm against which one measures cultural work and access to a rights-based radical pedagogy for conflicting publics, which is, I think, what Am's work is, why I'm raising this question in this context, that I think that what Am's work is doing and what the extension of from the gold brick. Do I have to pause? No, the gold brick. Money is part of that legacy. And I could go into the specific institutions, the prison education reform, education that I was involved in for many, many years, and with colleagues, Steve Duguid and others. At the time, Paul, and let me just finish here, and with a few references, Noam Chomsky's American Power and the New Mandarins, 1967, the Maxine Greene, The Public School and Private Vision, 1965, The New Left Reader, edited by Carl Oglesby, 1969, Protest in you can hear these titles, right? Revolutionary Nonviolence by David Dellinger, The Lives of Children by George Dennison. Recently, my friend and student, Bojan Trekov, who is sitting in the audience, pointed out that his school friend, who recently set himself on fire in Bulgaria, and as a martyr to the corruption and the force of economic law that was crushing some of the former Soviet colonies. Martyrdom was also on the agenda in the 1960s, but it took a different form. One knew from de Tocqueville, Linus Pauling, Daniel Burstein's The Image, C. Wright Mills, McLuhan and more McLuhan, not to forget that Time magazine in 1966 exploited the image of the hippie and yippie SDS and the Chicago generation by making them the man of the year. The new left discovered what the older generation, my own, had known all along, that the United States was becoming a system of professional managers manipulating public opinion about the Vietnam War. Journals like Thilo's New Generation, Freedom Press, and others were seriously attempting to link European thought to a new politics. And there were the important European immigrants and exiles who spoke from the heart of history. Most importantly, Herbert Marcuse, whose essay, The Problem of Violence and the Radical Opposition, in 1970 already sounded the death knell of the new left's inability to have an organization that, like the old left that he left as an exile, would address the non-technological needs of the unprivileged. To recall this today is like citing old jalopies in the slow lanes of the educational freeways. I kind of like that, actually. I first had old cars, but then I thought, oh, jalopies is better. These names give experiential weight to the often termed radicalism of the counterculture, especially when the counterculture disappeared, to be reformed in other iterations. I'm coming to the end. The point, class analysis, the critique of schooling as a mass of disciplines, the issues become instead attention to the growth patterns of the multiversity and finding ways to recycle the 60s and into protest, into eventually oppose the market model university. At this time, and let me just end here, I want to end on the theme of the conflicted publics around student movements. When Jürgen Habermas wrote about the student movement in 1967, he admitted, we sociologists did not reckon with the possibility that students could play a political role in developed industrial societies. The values of status mobile and socially climbing middle-class families accord with the universalist values of the university tradition. Students were threatened and frightened that they were being reconstructed by the university. So it was a psychological as well as a political and social, into a middle-class training ground, which would reinforce the economy of scale with all those expeditionary forces pitted against poor countries. The barrier against the full exploitation of cultural capital, the barrier against it was the student. The essence of these classrooms, however, cannot be explained through pedagogy. They were places of particular experiences that were fleeting and transient, that might be described as the proto-incommensurable community whose measure of value could not be taken with certainty because in the long run these experiences were not easily transportable to other social circumstances or political. They were made up of the ambiguity of the Vietnam War as the image of the state complicity and lying with the extremes of capitalism and a society that really needed a new name. Military, industrial complex, administrative society, corporate America, one-dimensional society. That's Marcuse's. Often the war was carried into the classroom, the fear that the individual professor was complicit with the system. I don't know whether that fear comes into the classroom now. This concreteness and particularity of the experience of war gave the illusion that the past could be mastered by mastering the university, which was itself a product of the unmastered past of economic production translated into cultural production. At the time, one tried to grasp the depth of the contradictions. Utopia is a historical concept, Herbert Marcuse declared in a 1967 talk that I showed you at the beginning, at that time. It refers to projects for social change that are considered impossible. Impossible for what reasons? At that time, Marcuse said the words, the students were the incipient intelligentsia. But when the Vietnam War ended, the student movement ended as well. Colonial liberation struggles emerged throughout the world of the poor, but also helped to open up this world to the overwhelming spread of capitalism and the new state-nation powers, including the Canadian small nation version. One response to this crisis was to rebuild the university as bastions and citadels of modern learning, which is exactly what happened in Simon Fraser in the 1970s. Thus, the culture of extremes in the Cold War was lived out in both the desire for a radical pedagogical turn and a desire to open the doors of the university to more and more students. The critique of the university danced in tandem with economic necessities to broaden the university to include more students, more of everything, the Walmart model, the extremes of mass culture and the knowledge industry meet. Thank you.
going to ask our panelists to join us up here. While they're coming up here, I'll introduce them if I can find the right piece of paper. One moment. Joining us is Natalie Knight, who is a PhD student in English at SFU. Next to her is Andrea Creamer, who's a fourth-year visual arts student here at SFU. Next to her is Didier Morelli, who's an MFA in visual arts here in this building, and next to him is Nicholas Perrin. And so I'm just going to pass it on to the four of you to respond. So,
do the lights have to be so high? Yeah, you really can't see anybody. If you just turn them down a little bit, that'd be kind of nice. Don't you think?
Hey, I totally get
Yeah,
it.
I think we're in agreement.
Yep, it's not happening.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jerry. It was really... I'm sorry? Oh, I've got to talk to the mic. Thank you very much, Jerry. It was really interesting, and as I'm sitting here thinking about what I have prepared to say, I'm very curious about how these two things are going to sit alongside each other and how they complement each other. And not knowing exactly what's going to come after me, I think that it's an exciting possibility. So it's an honor to be a part of this panel and discussion about the state of the pleasantly controversial and radically corporate university, descriptives that widely characterize North American post-secondary institutions as much as they apply to where we are right now, on unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The ever-present problem of space and its injustice is one of the multiple determinants in the reproduction of hegemonic knowledges that has serious effects on how we both imagine and materially reproduce our social selves. Space makes a big difference. This immediate acknowledgement of the layers of place and displacement is provisional, basic, crude even, as if the rhetoric of speaking to colonization might touch some of the history that we've inherited, might roughly brush the cheeks of these institutional monstrosities and leave an effective trace that could linger a little while. On the other hand, acknowledging the contradictions and misrepresentations of where we are does make more visible how the university embodies the rhetorical and material practices of a 21st century neo-colonial neoliberalism. And I do think this plays out on the level of visibility more often than not, so that we are baited into building strategies to make visible the structures that foreclose our self-determination of these very institutions, spaces, and social relationships we've inherited and those we actively construct. In other words, the university participates in a wider social, cultural, and highly economic program that squeezes our politics into issues of representation. I mean that it uses policies of legibility and visibility on the one hand, and erasure and opacity on the other, to capitalize on the work we do to literally change the way we move through the institution and the world, at the level of the space we use and the social relations we constantly make and revise. Representation is a smart trick that still works, making something visible in order to contextualize it, depoliticizing it at the very moment it seems to gain a platform. Context, of course, is most often capital, and whoever provides the context also makes the capital gain. This plays out in rather blunt, even mundane ways on the level of space. Here's an example. In 2007, Simon Fraser University was one of 24 public post-secondary institutions in British Columbia to receive $600,000 as part of the provincial government's Aboriginal post-secondary educational strategy. It's all in capitals. The money was mandated to build a self-determined Aboriginal student gathering space at each of the universities. The funds came out of the quote, and capitalized again, new relationship, heralded by the Transformative Change Accord, in caps, signed by the provincial and federal governments, as well as the BC Assembly of First Nations, the First Nations Summit, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs in 2005. In other words, this was truth and reconciliation money, which, coming from the United States as I do, I like to think of as recognition and representation money, some version of reparative affirmative action that pumps the colonized and seemingly invisible subject with a little capital, rendering her hyper-visible in a soft economic restructuring that, though incredibly problematic, seems laughably inconceivable south of the colonial border. So at the same time that SFU received these funds, they were in the process of building Saywell Hall, a glassy and eco-award-winning structure that abuts the academic quadrangle on the Burnaby campus. Without consultation with any of the 3 Aboriginal student organizations, the administration appropriated the $600,000 to build a wide-open atrium that connects Saywell Hall with the AQ, right next to Renaissance Coffee. It's worth repeating that the administration did not consult any of the student organizations or any First Nations campus representatives, meaning that the notion of a self-determined space was foreclosed as soon as the money changed hands, from the right hand of the government to the left hand of the administration. In order to use the so-called self-determined Aboriginal gathering space, Aboriginal students have to contact space services to book time and are given no preference over any other group who wishes to access the space. Campus space services also charge rent to use the space, allowing the university to both privatize and monetize a new articulation of a very old but still rather physically fit colonial trope. So there's 2 levels of spatial displacement that occur in this alarmingly easy example, perhaps a little bit of a boring example, but nonetheless. At the same time that SFU makes visible their Aboriginal student body through the publicized construction of a space, they appropriate more than $500,000 to fund part of a structure they were already in the process of building. And now that the atrium is built, they continue a legacy of erasure by giving no priority to Aboriginal students in the use of the space. This may seem like not a real detail, but yesterday I was walking through the atrium to grab a coffee, and there was a small career fair set up, and there were Army recruiters that had a table in the career center, or career fair. So in 2010, a letter was drafted by the First Nations Student Association to President Petter, detailing the ways in which the funds were appropriated and misused. And since then, the administration has agreed to build a new gathering space in the AQ to be accessed beginning this fall, full 8 years after they received the funding. So on a good day, the university is an institutional conglomeration of public aspirations, short-circuited through private money in collusion with state policy. Trying to recoup the radicalness of the university is exactly the project that the university hopes we participate in, because it enacts a bit of eraser on the 3-way corporate state-university marriage that most of us in this room are probably rather intimate with. We are, quote, given space or engaged with in ways that smooth over our raggedness and indignance on panels, in audiences, and in classrooms, all in spaces that are actively profiting from our dissent. In this situation, I want to return to the crude, or a revitalization of a politics of the crude, or maybe of the jalopy, as Jerry was calling it, that insists on a materialism that cares less about how it thinks through its structures of being, its institutional divisions, co-optations, mutations, and flailings, as it does the immediate effects of bodies and the discrete spaces we negotiate. I think if we pay a little attention, we can feel neoliberalism as a hum that sends our spaces into particular vibrations. I wonder how we might make something out of this hum on a crude stage that articulates both sophistication and noise with pleasure. To strike a pose of participation and maybe even reconciliation within our institutions while organizing elsewhere in ways that quite consciously contradict the rhetoric we perform and the reformist measures we might sincerely promote within the university. The example of the Saywell Hall atrium and its spatial foreclosure of Indigenous self-determination that I've outlined above was researched as a short report for a non-academic research group that myself and a couple people in the audience started in January. We began the group in frustration in response to the material, institutional, and social contradictions of radical knowledge production that I think this evening is revealing. So my thought is that turning to self-organizing research and action inside and beyond the university might be one way to respond to the question of what kind of university we want. So I suppose one that's split open, maybe, and one that's less concerned about its representative identity and more concerned about what it's doing in a city and in a space.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks, Natalie. So what kind of university do we want? I have asked myself this question over and over since I began to think about this panel. But I think this question has actually been following me since I started pursuing post-secondary education. First at Langara College and now here at SFU. I have attended 3 separate campuses over the last 8 years, and all have been under some form of construction. Not unlike the rest of Vancouver, they have been expanding, creating more densely built environments and adding more bums and seats. Like units in a new condominium development, it seems more is better. And as a student, this is an everyday reality you become acutely aware of. In a narrow business sense, our presence is tied to the economic growth of the university, which is probably also why class sizes have increased and services have decreased. But the growth of the university is also increasingly tied to the growth of other commercial spaces, such as malls or mixed-use realty developments, transforming students, now seen as potential shoppers and renters, into amenities for private interests. Pursuing these kinds of development strategies, Simon Fraser University has built multiple campuses without ever designating sufficient free spaces for students. It's in my opinion that this is a continuing and materially embedded practice that I relate to the idea of spatial injustice. Without spaces that are truly free for students to use, it is harder for us to come together, to organize, occupy the campuses we attend, and find collective power. While such organization can and does happen elsewhere, it also will often struggle to claim a real sense of ownership of the university. Offered complicated leases, regulated rights, and potentially unstable conditions, we are left to rent the spaces we inhabit in the university. And when university campuses are offered as resources for corporations and other organizations for private conferences, our physical presence as students, both in mass and even individually, seems only to mess up the beautifully designed architectural spaces and scenic views. I would argue, however, that spatial justice and the simple right to be and become in a space is as important as the education being given to the bums in the seats at the university. The university is a place to learn and express ideas, but this proves potentially difficult when every area has been, in quotes, bought and claimed, with every classroom demarcated by signage, a gift from some wealthy benefactor. As a result, the subjective experience of students is not only complicated and compromised by the politics and business practices of the university, but also the politics and business practices of whichever patron's lounge we are vying to find a seat in, if we are lucky enough. I don't bring this up to sound ungrateful or entitled or jaded. If anything, I've enjoyed my time at SFU profoundly, and my own self-awareness of these issues have come from going to the School for Contemporary Art Studios at 611 Alexander, which is located about a dozen blocks east of here. That place is everything that this campus is not. It is messy and busy and full of students, and our presence there is a visual experience through art and posters and ramshackle furniture. The space is continually reimagined and used as needed and not confined by prescriptive architecture. I feel privileged to have been a part of that studio and to have the freedom to be and become in a space. No one there mops the floor behind every step I take, and the only reception I might accidentally intrude upon is the one that I'm always invited to, hosted by other students. As remarkable as the studios at 611 are, however, they aren't particularly accessible to the public, which is the real limitation. I recently began researching the precursor to the studios at 611 Alexander, the Perel Building, and later Gallery, which was located across the street from Woodward's at 112 Hastings Street. From the late 1970s until the early 1990s, this space transitioned from a studio space for SFU faculty to a teaching space and then to a collectively run gallery space facilitated by faculty and students from SFU School for Contemporary Arts, but which was also inclusive of faculty and students from UBC and Emily Carr. As I understand the history of the older space, it was a lot of work to run, and maybe too much and too big of an undertaking for a small group of people. But despite its challenges, however, it ran under the radar and was self-organized and experimental and fostered community and helped produce and support successful artists. At this moment in time, and especially in this part of the city, that kind of space, organized and run the way that it was, both as part of the university while also somehow autonomous from it, seems sadly impossible. Squashed between inflated price of property and university bureaucracy, too much has changed since then, for us as students as much as citizens. Despite everything, of course, students are resilient and inventive. And while we can and should learn from the past, we shouldn't get caught up in the nostalgia or overcome by our disappointment in the present. Struggle for good and bad is an ongoing process. The truth is, if we have to leave the university to do the things we want to do, to experiment or to organize or to find freedom and to occupy a space of our own, it will be at the university's loss and not ours. If notions of fairness and justice are not persuasive enough to change the values and priorities of the university alone, maybe the dumbness of the economics might. At the end of the day, it is our bums in their seats, and we can always sit elsewhere.
One, two. No. Thank you to the organizers of this panel for inviting me to be part of it, and special thanks to Jerry Zaslove for sharing his views on universities with us in the hopes of further opening dialogue on pedagogy and pedagogical models in North American, and more specifically, Canadian institutions of higher learning. In light of Dr. Zaslove's historical grounding, I'd like to state that I am the son of two Sixties parents who were the first university graduates of their families. One an immigrant family, the other a Québécois de souche, for whom education represented an idealist form of social empowerment rooted in social critique and cultural activism. I was asked to be part of this panel because I have, throughout my short time at SFU School for the Contemporary Arts, voiced my concern and frustration that the institution I call home is not the space of open and dynamic exchange, growth, and creation I had hoped it would be. The university, or in my present case, the art school institution, no longer exists and promotes the principles it once did not very long ago. Far are we from the University of Bologna's 1158 charter, the Constitutio Habitat, which provided scholars from all over Europe the safety to gain access, legal protection, and travel rights for the purpose of study. Perhaps this may seem irrelevant to us today. However, the notion of academic freedom in medieval Europe placed the university as an unparalleled, groundbreaking, and avant-garde institution. Today, the university continues to foster ideals of freedom of speech, open and flexible pedagogy, and the furthering of knowledge and research. However, it also grapples with the increasing pressure placed upon it to survive within a capitalist economy and a neoliberal ideology that values product over process, results over experience, and order over chaos. And so, as a student of three major Canadian universities over the past 3 years, Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, University of Toronto in Toronto, Ontario, and Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, I find myself asking why. Why continue to feed and perpetuate the university economy that no longer fosters thought, creation, and collective living, but instead looks to manufacture success, solidify hierarchy, and impose a proper social behavior? More to the point, why do art programs concentrate on reproducing existing artistic models, training students to copy and emulate art history, mimicking styles and signatures of established masterpieces in order to repeat, rehabilitate, and at best, reenact the past? Frankly, I don't know why. The only answer I can fathom is, unfortunately, it still remains the best place to be. Having been a student in three major Canadian universities in 3 years, I have observed similarities in how these institutions can no longer function with as much freedom as they once did. Mostly, these schools are operated as private enterprises, prioritizing the creation of objects rather than process. Pressure is exerted on developing functional and profitable research, thus instating heavily divided and segmented parts of the university that function unevenly, are funded unevenly, and develop unevenly. This formulaic and instrumentalized space follows a strict hierarchy, deepening the divide between direction, faculty, and student body. In Quebec, where I partook in the Printemps Érable of 2012, the outcry was against the resulting alienation, inaccessibility, and frustration that have developed from the new direction and recent governance of the university. Although much of the English public press that reported on the protests emphasized the neoliberal government's intended 75% tuition increase over a period of 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, the uprising that took place and developed into mass civil disobedience, nonviolent protest, violent protest, and picketing was the result of a university system that no longer provides academic freedom. Dealing with ex-university presidents who were let go within the first year of their mandate and thus still being paid their full $500,000 wages, with universities seeking to establish a strong international research reputation by creating satellite buildings that they could not pay for themselves, with these same universities seeking any type of financial support and allowing companies like Pepsi-Cola to advertise, lobby, and run promotion centers within the school, the students were left with a full arsenal of reasons to take to the streets. If indignation and a sense of urgency characterized the Occupy movements of the past year around the world, a very similar sentiment mobilized students faced with a future of debt and unemployment. 7 weeks ago, I partook in a panel in the other room across the hall in the context of Antonio Muntadas about academia. While the panel was formed of highly reputable faculty and community, members of the SFU and UBC community, amongst them Serge Guilbeault, I was surprised, worried, and ultimately saddened to see that out of the 60 or so people in the audience, approximately 10 were students. The rest were mostly professionals in the arts, education, or somehow involved in the immediate SFU Woodworth community. Is this kind of event, one where those who are directly engaged and affected by the changes in the institution at the university are not present, even relevant? Are 5 professors discussing their views, opinions, and research on their prospective universities and crisis in universities a good way to address this issue? Is speaking out enough? Where is my generation? Where is the generation that will suffer from these changes? Uninterested? Uninterested in pure speculative talk? Maybe disillusioned and cynical. I'm intrigued by the central place education is commanding in recent art theory, critical thinking, and our own Vancouver proliferation of lectures, book launchings, panels, and visiting artist talks on the subject over the past 6 months. Considering that visual art has only been part of the academic university institution in Canada since the 1960s, that most of the ideas and individuals that drove these radical art programs are now retiring, disillusioned, and nostalgic, that more than ever the challenges of art's very form, funding, and purpose is up in the air. I ask, where are we going? Why are we seeing such a resurgence of 60s aesthetics and young practices? Why does art seem more and more entrenched in commodity exchange, and why do art schools encourage it by celebrating in educating art stars? Can art still affect change? Can art still produce knowledge? Are we living the total implosion of a democratic dream based on accessible education and experimental making? Is this the result of one generation's inability to pass on and recognize the emergence of a new generation, or is this the victory of the right-wing conservative politics? I am no expert on academia, pedagogy, or the state of the university. I am a student who dreamt his entire life of one day giving back through teaching, and who no longer thinks that this will be possible, manageable, or even desirable. I would like to close with 2 questions. By show of hands, how many here are graduate students enrolled in a university program? How many here are undergraduate students enrolled in a university undergraduate program? Thank you.
Leave those house lights up. I also want to thank Am and Sabina for organizing this panel, and say that it's kind of an honor to be speaking or responding to Jerry's talk, both in the sense that he has quite a stake in what we're talking about here, and that I see him as a role model, because I'm also a bit of a free-form rambler, so I'm going to start with the current history of the state, and we're going to get to pedagogy later. So I think one of the big differences, I don't need to start like that. One of the huge differences in between the 1960s and now is obviously the transformation that's taken place in the state in terms of relationship to the market. And we call it Natalie was the first. Jerry didn't use the word, actually, I don't think, but Natalie said neoliberalism. And so that's the neoliberal state is characterized by an end to, I think, social craft in terms of how it corresponds to the university. So at least in the United States, you can mark the end of the state being actually concerned about crafting society with the end of the Johnson presidency. And so I would say that the university, as being a public institution, this really affects how it is that it's being organized. And it's probably a little bit more recent in Canada. I apologize, I don't know so much about the sort of like on-take of neoliberalism on the national level here. But what happens when you lose the state as a sort of rational planning instrument for society is, and this is kind of like playing off of a Hegelian sort of thing, is that the pressure to express coherence is removed from the level of society and from a larger structural level and kind of like downgraded to the level of the individual, if that makes any sense. So because no one is planning where the hell we're all headed, the sort of like need to have a sort of clear, rational bottom line and to be able to express some sort of sense of coherence about what's going on in our lives happens on the level of individuality. And it's not that the individualism of neoliberalism is like some sort of like lack within us. It's something that's happened to us. Yeah, this is a new way in which we have to assess who we are. This is the environment in which we're teaching now. And so, and within, let's say, after the financial collapse and the demise of, I wrote it down earlier, we'll just read it. So what I'm talking about here in terms of why we need to think about the state is that there are new complications wherein in a crisis of upward mobility within the society, I think most of us as progressives in the room, I'm assuming, are trying to make it emotionally tenable for our students to understand themselves on the losing side of capital while still trying to imbue them with some sort of sense of agency. And so there's a real, just in the problems of upward mobility, a real disjunct in between pedagogically what it is that I have to give and the certain analysis that I'm passing off and the receptivity of the students in front of me. And I think especially in a largely immigrant school like SFU, where some families have been working for generations to get their students into this situation, sacrificing so that they can be successful in the West, that my particular brand of kind of like left-oriented critique first, kind of like hard positioning, the whole world is unethical, it's very unpalatable and hard for them to figure out what to do with. Yeah? And so just putting that out there at the beginning of it. The next layer of this is when Jerry begins to talk about a separation of intellectual work from manual labor, and the intellectual work becomes separate. Well, now, separate from intellectual work is, and I think he clarified, he said that the turn to intellectual work led intellectuals to have to become more public, actually. That the separation of intellectual work from manual labor led towards a sort of consideration of publicness. Now, we've gone from intellectual work to service work. Yeah? And it doesn't do away with the publicness, but in the construction also with what's happening, the disillusion of the state, social craft and everything like that, and this move from intellectual work to service work, the way in which the public is charged has also shifted. It's not rational in the same way. So the person in the 60s who was most famous for this was Habermas, and he puts forward a version of the rational public sphere that kind of positioned, someone just waved to me from the audience, sorry, that positioned, don't do that, that positioned, I think, how it is that intellectuals were supposed to work and how it is that they were public and the certain quality of what they were putting forward. So rational positionality, a way in which we thought ideas were going to get worked through. Well, now in the new service economy, this is actually more effective. Yeah? And again, this isn't something that we can choose, it's something that's happened to us. Yeah? So I think that rather than the public being rationally dominated, it's actually effectively dominated now. And unfortunately, this has done nothing to gearing it to a more gender equal. It's actually still pretty male dominated and therefore effectively kind of gross. And so this is also something that I think is happening. It is an update to what Jerry has put forward. And so what I want to, I guess, bring it specifically into like putting some sort of framework that's usable for how we think about the university now as a term or a kind of, a term put forward by this art sociologist Pascal Gillen and he calls the university now the catering regime. And I think when Jerry refers to Walmart, Natalie's talking about the way in which we rent different spaces from the university, and so this, thinking about the catering regime, and then jump back to the state, and there is this kind of what Jerry put forward as President Stevenson's kind of idea of the university. If there's an open university frightened by its own freedom, I think is what you said. Yeah, this is actually a general social problem. That's what neoliberalism is. Actually, it puts forward freedom as its main objective and its main ideal and social project, but governmentality and management is the way that it tends to deal with this. So you can think of the catering regime as kind of like the neoliberal framework for where they give us all of these options and then can kind of try and manage our options and put forward a friendly, happy face, the university or whatever, the happy university as Jerry calls it. So the catering regime is something that I'm kind of wanting to put out for the conversation after this as a way to think about the university that we're in right now. So if that passage through all of that still makes sense, then I can pose the question, in this environment, what is it that I do with my politics? Yeah? Why am I here? As Didier say, I don't really have a hope of reaching tenure someday. I can tell you that the deeper you go into grad school, the harder it is for me to actually materially support myself. Yeah? And that I'm not quite sure if it's a healthy life plan for me to lean into trying to do this with my life. And so as a progressive person, as a leftist, and still believing that at least the 3 letters at the end of my name are going to help me do something good for the world, or however it is that you want to justify it in shorthand, finishing your grad degree, what do I do in the meantime? What is my role? What is the project? Yeah, I don't think that we have... There's a misunderstanding in the way in which universities serve communities, because that is basically just through upward mobility. And so that's not really, or at least the way that people are approaching it. I think AM's program and what he's doing here, while it does... Unfortunately, it's not enough catering regime today because I miss the melon plates that are in the World Arts Center and everything like that. There's a certain aspect of extending public knowledge production and stuff like that you can still get out of universities. But generally, they're places where we all go now to get degrees and get better paying jobs. And the notion of the crafting better citizens, let's say, has been lost with Johnson when the state was actually forming a society. Yeah? And so it's no longer the same project. So what am I doing? And if it isn't entirely rational, if I don't think that the students are coming to me carrying information away, and if the type of information that I'm giving them goes, like the facts that a sort of like left position might put forward, go against everything that they've learned previously and are a bit hard to hold and bring about some sort of sense of personal crisis and defensiveness, like, hey, I need to get a job after this, and I'm not gonna start the revolution or whatever. I think actually what I put forward, and this is a hard realization in the last year, is a certain type of effective positioning, that I am okay with being incoherent. if I would say, which this talk surely demonstrates. And that I wrote it down really well, too. It's a particular understanding of the word criticality, in that criticality affirms the moment of not knowing in the process of knowing, and that a comfortableness with there not being any ethical clarity right now in a workplace, a doing away with the assumption that the way in which we can discursively position within the classroom and the university is enough, that we are indicted, that the knowledge that we have makes us responsible as subjects, yeah? And that it's okay to go out into the world and feel incoherent about this knowledge that we have about the unethical roles that we're playing, and that, I mean, I guess that's just what I would say, and that you can still be an agent, and that just speaking the problems, as Jerry ended with, and as Natalie ended with, is still pretty much all that we can do. From the perspective of the university, I think. And I'll end there.
Thank you all for your responses. I apologize I didn't introduce you properly because our guest speaker had stolen my bio sheet. But I think we're going to move right on to questions just shortly, but I just wanted to reference something that Jerry was talking about. A lot of the people in the 60s and 70s that were involved in these sort of radical projects. You mentioned Stokely Carmichael, R.D. Lang, Herbert Marcuse. Just last week, Jacob Jacobson, who's involved with the Copenhagen Free University, was in Vancouver to speak at UBC for a seminar, and he circulated a few of bits and pieces of his anti-historical research on the anti-University of London, and it kind of documents some of the framing of these projects within many people who were working within the institution at the time, and it's quite a fascinating document. But I'm going to circulate this around so people can take a look at it. But we're just going to open it up for questions. If you can just put your hand up, somebody will bring a microphone around to you. We just need that for the recording, so if you could just wait for that.
Could we do even less lights? We still can't see out there. Thank you.
Much better.
Did you guys have any questions for each other? Start. Or Jerry, did you want to respond to some of the comments that were made, maybe to begin?
Well, it's not a response. It's an unfree ramble. Or what did you say? Freeform ramble. Actually, I didn't feel it was a ramble so much as it was a constructing a narrative around naming where one has been. I wanted to say something about what Am has pointed out. The Free University movement. It was here in the 60s. There was relevant high alternative high schools were started. That's why I showed one of the high schools there. In my collection of schooling, the schooling of society. Paulo Freire's work was important. Yeah. Schooling. He was anti-hospital, anti-psychiatry, anti-schooling. I remember a talk Paulo Freire gave, and there was a room about 60 people, and it's maybe. And with this, I'll always remember this day, by the way, because we have a new pope, don't we? But you watch and see on the web how much information that will be passed around in terms of human rights about the new pope's history in Argentina and And it'll be very interesting just to see that. Now, why do I say that? I say it only to emphasize the theme of conflicted publics. That I think this is where we are now, historically, with a fragmented labor movement, with universities who are frightened. The reason I showed Bruegel's great picture was not just to show fish eating fish, but institutions eating children. And that's why he's pointing out to the child what you're in store for. So it's the Hobbesian leviathan of the monopoly of liberal globalization that we're talking about, as you pointed out, and that if I didn't use the words, it was implicit everywhere, in what I would call the new feudalization of the public sphere. That it's not that's what liberal capitalism is good at, is fragmenting and breaking things apart. But on the question of Am's work, I mean, we need to emphasize this, and I won't talk much further, is that the model of education that was on the agenda, and it still is, in radical, whether it's in theater, whether it's in elementary school, art school, negative space, and the movement of surreal, of post-conceptual art and so forth, has to do with creating negative space, creating incommensurable space. That's what you were talking about, I think. That where one knows it's in process, but you may feel like you don't quite belong there, but that it's a challenge to the framing of space that insists that it's what it is and nothing more than what it is. So occupying space says something about negative space. It says we're taking over space that doesn't belong to us, and we know it doesn't belong to us, but it's going to challenge the real estate space. Now, educationally, I think what's going on here is what I would call the deficiency model of negative space. All of a sudden, throughout the 60s and 70s, we started to think that you could teach people, if it moves, you can teach it. The prison education program, commercial drive, alternative university, and so forth and so on. And what does that mean? It means that you approach the artist, the student, not as if they are deficient, and what you were saying about, not as if they're deficient and need to have the history of art shoved down their throat. They have to know what beauty is and what good art is, for sure. But you also have to know where you're coming from, right? Not that you're deficient, but who are you, where are you, and what have you experienced? And that's the anti-deficiency model of education. Does that make any sense? It's talking about, in Am's work, it's finding different community. I don't even like that word community. I don't know. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't speak to me. Communities are groups of people who form together based on certain natural tendencies to think, talk, and change things. Sometimes they can do it, and sometimes they can't. So in other words, the university is selling what I call the crisis or adversity model of organization. They're not only afraid, but they're in crisis constantly, and they don't tell us in public what really that crisis is all about. They're not honest. So that goes back to what you're saying, is that they project this fear onto the public, And those of us in this room who know what that's about, the best thing we can do, as you're saying, is to challenge the fear and make sure that people are not afraid and that they have power. Anyway, I just wanted to. Not everybody is inadequate. The needs model of neglect, poverty, work-related. People bring to the table, in a Hegelian sense, something that needs to be cultivated. That's my Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any questions or comments out there? Somebody.
Is it on?
Not sure, actually. Yeah.
Hello? There you go. Jerry, you mentioned early on... Oh, okay. You alluded to SFU's self-mythologizing tendencies, and it seemed to me you were pointing in the direction of maybe the administration's tendency to co-opt its probably undeserved progressive reputation. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Well, can I do?
Yeah.
I meant that something very something specific historically, as well as capitalizing on nostalgia. The book, I meant that in some respects, the book about the desk drawer history radical campus, which became the more or less official history. In terms of scholarship, it's very poor because it didn't even interview the people who maybe they wouldn't have wanted to be interviewed, the people who created that in part fiction, in part reality of radicality. But what I meant specifically in terms of historical, the NDP government in 1972 was very unhappy with Simon Fraser. And Eileen Daly, who was the Minister of Education, was, and this is poor David Barrett's, whose new book has been written about David Barrett, who was a very interesting figure. They didn't like what was going on at SFU, the Social Democrats or the NDP. So in other words, throughout the 70s, up to maybe the financial exigency period in the 80s, again, recycling financial exigency, I chaired a department in 1979 to 1986, which went from 50 people, including lecturers, down to 32. Just cut. Okay, so my point is that throughout that period, it was a mandate of the president, whether it was Pauline Jewett or Bill Saywell, to ensure public confidence in the university, financial and so forth. One has to bear in mind, and I left this out of my talk, that the first Board of Governors in 1965 consisted of 8 businessmen and one from Vancouver, moguls, right, and one New Westminster businessman. It's pretty much the same now. But the whitewashing was on the agenda to ensure reliability, competence, management, and so forth. And speaking in terms of public sphere, poor Pauline Jewett, who was the first woman president here, the only one really. We've had women chairs of the Board of Governors. She was basically pretty much cannibalized by the whole system. She tried to make peace with the turmoil. So yes, to answer your question it's a long-winded answer, but it's a historical answer that if you live through it, you know that the agenda was to make sure that the public accountability was on the agenda, and that meant, of course, new faculties, new faculties, social sciences, and so forth, and new endowments, right? The humanities don't get $25 million the way the business faculty does, and the Gold Corp mining, as Steve Collis is a brilliant analyst of, knows the ethics and politics of that. Does that help?
The next question there.
Yeah, fill out the picture, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Forgive me. At times I wasn't following language, and maybe that's because I'm an undergrad, or the academic terminologies, or maybe just simply because it's me myself. I haven't tried to entrench myself in academia enough. So again, forgive me if you guys have already brought this up, and I just didn't catch it.
But I guess I wanted to start my question from the level of, is it possible that even the conception of, or the idea of a university is offensive towards the idea of creating accessible space for learning? The idea that it is confined to a building, that quite often it's been based off of creating professions out of information, creating hierarchies of elitism in terms of knowledge, separating those who know and don't know, and standardizing that information. So therefore, it's just kind of like repeating the space of there are those who get access to it, and there are those who don't. Yeah, if that makes sense.
The original Greek meaning for the word school is actually free time, where one does not practice economics or politics. And in terms of what you're saying, and like, I don't think there's any way around it. I think as soon as we begin to create institutions, they need money and there's struggles over what they're supposed to do. But that the original project of what university is supposed to be about, from the originary Western conception of it, is completely... That problem has been there forever and will be there forever, I guess. Unfortunately, the university has always been something that served power and had a discourse inside of it that was against power. I mean, like, I think, actually. And really, like, even the Reformation, Luther and the church, when universities in the West were Catholic, this was going on. And so, I don't know. There's no end in sight.
I have another question up there.
Do I have to? Okay. Thanks, everyone, for your talks. Just following that last question, though, I have some kind of lingering thoughts about the idea of public intellectualism within the private sphere of the university, and also self-organization within the university, which I automatically assume as is an institution. But maybe we have different understandings of what a university actually is, because I completely see it as a place that sells agency instead of create agency. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit more.
I think I do see the university as an institution, absolutely. My sense of how you engage, well, for one, I guess one thing is that I assume that whether you're in the university or not, you're engaged in multiple institutions all the time, and it's the negotiation of those contradictions and really problematic relationships that make up the friction that I think kind of translates maybe into what Nicholas is talking about on an affective level, but on another level translates into how much money you have and how much your ability to access education. So I guess for one side, I would say you're never outside of dealing with that. And then the other thing, I think too, that might go back to your question too about deschooling a little bit, is that if the institution or the university is a site that has a ton of money, we are still thinking beings with some amount of agency, as co-opted as it may feel sometimes. And if you view the university as a place to access funding and then do with it what you want to do or find a way to live, it's not perfect, but I think it's one way to use the university.
Somebody back there? We'll just take 3 more questions.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question, I guess, or I'm not sure if it's either one entirely. My understanding of the term university, or universitatis in Latin, is that it's essentially the proper word for corporation. So how much of this crisis or incoherence is structural and systemic and impossible to remove because corporations are essentially fictitious and don't exist except in the minds of those who use them? And if the panel has any comments on that, and if just one more comment, if there's not an inherent hypocrisy involved, that if you address the elephant in the room, as it were, with undergraduate students especially. Well, what are they doing? They're buying a franchise in a corporation, essentially, something that may not have any actual substance in, I presume most people, especially in public today, are materialists, at least when interacting with one another. They don't really use theological conceptions to ground themselves in public discourse. So how much of the lack of coherence is simply structural and systemic?
That might be another talk. No, I mean, like, entirely. I think you're... I don't know if that's as much of a question as like an open question. How much? I don't know. I think a lot. What you raised in the question for me in terms of expectations today is students coming in looking for competencies, and I think that you're right, that maybe the theological grounding of some of us who've made it into grad school, and I've actually kind of said that I think I came to my PhD program looking for a religion, is that it's that there's a frustration there, the contradiction in between the two, and I think you're right, but I don't know. I don't know if anybody else can resolve it.
I would definitely follow with that. I mean, my frustrations are within the contradiction, because it still remains the best place for me to be, and it still remains the place that funds me, and it still remains the place that allows me to meet the most interesting people to have this discussion with. And in no way do I turn my back on that and brush that away. But when I sit down and think about it, and when I'm faced with the daily issues of what are the problematics within it, I do also realize that maybe stepping out is a possibility. Maybe abandoning the word is a possibility. Maybe creating an opposition and challenging it from the inside isn't enough. And so, attacking the root of the word or going back to the root of the word, I have thought about not using anti-university, but just abolishing it entirely. And not using free university, but moving beyond that. And what would that mean? Would we then actually be able to separate ourselves from all the paradigms and the problematics that have established themselves through time? But no, it's in no way. In no way do I think that I can separate myself from it at this current moment. In no way am I ungrateful for what it has given me. I'm only ungrateful for the fact that, or I'm only upset with the fact that as much as it gives, it likes to take, and it likes to give with another hand somewhere else, and you don't always know where that hand is, and yet oftentimes that hand is in an undesirable place, and you find out too late. Definitely acknowledge that.
Go ahead, Jerry. Then we have two questions.
Jeff wants to say, I want to hear what... Just quickly, really quickly, I think the question about building, if I understand it, is the place where you are socialized in a performative space. But when you're talking about the idea of a university, not so much the experience of it, but you're talking about an ideological construct. And that is to say, to link a couple of questions, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the university, and more so now than before, has co-opted the idea of relevance. That was a concept that came as a political, cultural, the university as a social movement in the 60s. But now relevance is a Walmart concept, right? It can mean anything to whatever clientele that you feel you're appealing to. So you can have multiple programs, multiple identities, and so forth. So we're talking then about the reification of the idea of the university around very particular, examinable ideological constructs that can be looked at and named in terms of their monetary value and their surplus value, right? For example, the digitalization of the university. And there's a very wonderful, very good book derived from Paul Virilio and Baudrillard, published by Semiotext, by an Italian writer, that talks about the digital cultural surplus that one has to deal with now. And this is, the university loves this. They love the cultural surplus that's performed in the digital positive space. It's no longer negative, it's positive space. or in another way of thinking about it, it's dead space that is animated by the client learner who is active in that negotiation. But it's not a social contract. What we're talking, the contract between your client, your people that you deal with, and the one wants to make some kind of communal relationship, it should be a social contract that's freely negotiated and entered into with the people who are. And I think that maybe has something to do with what you were saying.
I have a question right there, and then Jeff after that.
Yeah, so I'm hoping to maybe think about a return or to the model, or not a return to the model, but a return to the question of the free university or the anti-university that has been brought up a few times. And I mean, I think Didier just touched upon this in perhaps having a desire to move even past that model to something that is more in the realm of the yet to be discovered or the possible. But I wonder, and perhaps it goes back to looking at the Printemps l'Érable, but whether that movement, as much as in Didier's characterization, it's also partially a move to reclaim academic freedom, can also be something that strives towards a free university and a universalization of the possibilities of the university against the particularization and the drive towards surplus that Jerry's just articulated. And I think this is an especially pertinent question, given that 2 weeks ago, rather, in Quebec, you have the final move towards the decision that tuition fees are going to be raised in indefinite, continuant way indexed to, what was the ridiculous 3%. Thing they came up with? Well, it's not 3%. That's how they have modeled it, but it's going to be indexed, decided year by year to disposable income on the average disposable income on the provincial level. And those talks were boycotted by ASSE, the largest student organization, because they, from the beginning, disallowed the possibility of even bringing up the free university. And I think this drives back to the question that Marian was talking about when we're discussing where things fall in terms of the established hierarchies of the university. How are we hoping to break those hierarchies apart? I take Nicholas's point that the university is a place that has hierarchies, and that hierarchies aren't something that are going to disappear overnight. It's a problem that's coming from a long, long history. But I don't think that this should deaden our horizon, and I'm curious about what the possibilities that we see currently being mobilized are.
I personally hope for a wave of new accreditations in community-level universities that I honestly think that it's the scale and corporatism of a lot of universities that keep us from functioning as educators in the way exactly that we want to. And I think a reworking of research and pedagogy and the relationship in between those two things. In large universities, it's really hard to figure out when I'm researching totality what that has to do with my neighborhood and making those articulations. And it often takes, and I mean, there are people who can do it. You know, they're sitting in the room, but it takes 50, 30, 40 years to gain those skills and then to be able to repackage that and give it to someone else so that they're useful tools. So in terms of doing away with some of the, I would say on that level, there should be a hierarchy if someone puts 40 years into figuring out how to put something together, and that it's a useful, I'm happy to be their student, but that we can also have universities that function, and I don't I don't have a different word for development, but are set in their space and are trying to generate knowledge and being honest about economic conditions and potentials that people have to make their lives better. And I imagine a smaller scale university that someday maybe I would like to work in, actually.
To answer your question more specifically about what's happening in Quebec, even with the tuition increase, I have no solutions in terms of long-term planning for universities and how to break the hierarchy. But the interesting thing in Quebec is that, sure, there is this wavering 3%, which will move throughout the years, increase, but the student movement as a whole overthrew a government that had been in place solidly in place for many, many years, and that actually there was no horizon of that government actually being brought down. But really accelerated the process, and beyond that created, from the sense that I get from it from going back and speaking to friends, a deep divide and also just unsettlement in the community, in the province, which some people return to the we know of the 80s and the 90s of separatism, but sort of this amazing sense of student power, of the ability for people to merge into the streets as 300,000 to completely shut down one of the largest economic motors of the country, and to then process to change, whether it be a governmental change of the government or change of the institution. And so I find it amazing how it's allowed for an emergence in sort of local explorations of students feeling empowered, of no longer feeling alienated, of wearing the red square beyond the summer and using that as a symbol of exactly, and using that as a symbol to identify. I don't plan on wearing the red square every day, but I do wear it with the clothes that I have on my bag sometimes, and it's this moment of identifying with a movement, with a generation, with generations plural, because it wasn't so much necessarily of one generation versus another. And so just that unsettling, that shake at the bottom, I think, is enough for the time being. And as we saw last year in Quebec, things can move rapidly. Things can degenerate and collapse, and then rebuilding occurs.
Just got two comments with Steve and then Jeff. So,
I'll be really quick and curtail this. And I appreciate, Didier, the last sentiment you were on there at the very end, and appreciate everyone's comments here. But just a real brief comment. The things we're talking about here: fear, precarity, downward mobility, diminishing returns. Aren't problems unique to the university. They're problems that characterize crisis capitalism writ large at this stage in history. And therefore, it's not surprising they're at the university. It might be disappointing because we have some, however, watered-down, idealized notions of what the university could be, might be. So our problem isn't with what's happening to the university, or that's not our argument. Our argument's with capitalism. And that's what we need to fight. Maybe the university is one place we fight it because that may be the place where we are for a period of our lives. We work there, we study there, whatever. It's feeling the same effects as the rest of society around it. It's where we are. It's where we can fight. That's one comment. Then pick up the other thing that Nicholas said about the future and changes in the institutions. Probably what most people would suggest is going to happen now is there'll be a very few elite universities that are research universities that will be very expensive to go to, and elite people will be able to go there. And then there'll be a whole bunch of what we used to call community colleges that most people will teach at. When you teach, that's what your job will be. It'll be temporary, badly paid, a horrible place to work. But in some ways, this opens up, and this is a bleak picture that a lot of people are painting these days. But in some ways, it does maybe open up a lot of opportunities for the kinds of free schools we're talking about, because there's going to be lots of people who want to learn and will have to create that and organize it themselves, because the space, the options out there are going to be very limiting.
Does the dissatisfaction of the university only come from being in the university, though? So then, what happens if everybody just jumps ship from the university to the free school or to the other model? I've been trying to figure out how to say this. What happens when everybody, even the administrators or whatever, they all get tired and they all just go over to something else, and then it just duplicates the same thing but with a new name or something. I don't know how it would work, but that's what I was just kind of thinking about. I don't know.
Jeff, for the final comment question.
I have a comment for Nicholas that relates to Nicholas's comments, and then a question for Natalie and Andrea. Nicholas, I found it really compelling, the narrative that you developed, where the shift from statecraft has led to the taking apart of that kind of project of the national citizen. And just, I think, to bring that into the present, I think that kind of statecraft was reformed into a form of biopolitics and revanchism as we moved from the 70s model of the notion of a national citizen to from the neoliberal state and then to neoliberal individual, atomized individual. I think what was really compelling for me in parts of what Jerry was talking about was exactly this pinpointing of this moment in the 1970s of the national project of education within Canada, late 60s into the 70s, but pinpointing particularly that movement that Trudeau initiated where life gave way to lifestyle, and that movement to develop the national citizen precisely split where manual labor was devalued, pushed aside, and politics and the citizen based on lifestyle took its place. So a little bit, I guess what I'm cautioning is that moment that perhaps seemed as if it was very productive in the production of a democratic national citizen that was open to education was also an intermediary stage that leads to this new form of statecraft that the symbol is not so much the flag but an aerial drone, let's say. So then the question I want to pose for Natalie and Andrea is around the impossibility of the university. And if we respatialize the university to repoliticize the university, and I want to pick up on what Jerry mentioned, that the idea of the coming radical pedagogy would be in the classroom, if not the university. And that rescaling to me seems really optimistic and productive in that moment. But I'm wondering if in the kernel of both of your comments, there's a respatialization that can actually do away with the university, that can call to the foreground the impossibility of the university, and to think of the knowledge production existing in multiple scales simultaneously, rather than having to always and continually be caught between a model of inside or outside the university. So whether it's the outside, the imagined utopian outside can be the free university, but what if we rescale that and repoliticize it? And we start thinking of, as some people in seminars were in the last weeks talking about the hallways as a productive spaces for knowledge, but also to rethink the classroom. So just to rescale so that we don't always working on this inside-outside binary. That's actually a question.
You guys want to take that on?
I think specifically, I think inside and outside of the classroom wasn't even just so much what my tensions are is even just entering a building like this or even like SFU Burnaby, where there is different types of learning happening in the hallways or in other spaces, but then we're constantly having to renegotiate or be asked to move along, as had actually happened to DTA yesterday. He was escorted away, from what I understand, from security for actually just being in the foyer. So, which is a hallway or a free gathering space, and maybe he was learning or participating in it. So, I'm not even sure like if it's the classrooms anymore or the hallways. Like I think maybe it is just impossible. Maybe it has become too corporatized or too planned out or something for us. And maybe it is just taking to the streets or to a new location that keeps on getting kind of tossed around.
Yeah, I think I meet a lot of people in the university. Is one thought that I had, who either are there as my peers or people who I'm supposed to be teaching, or people I'm learning from. And so one thing that's been fantastic for is being able to tutor students. And I started doing that because I was in this school, but we meet off campus. And there is something, it seems really sort of mundane to talk about it in a way, but there is something very unique about the experience every time it happens, I think, for both the student who I'm tutoring and myself, and it's not a one-way relationship of knowledge sharing in the slightest. I've gotten book recommendations from them, so there's like an academic side to it. I mean, they're undergraduates, right, in first, second year, but I don't think that distinction carries when you're outside of the university setting, you know. But I also get other kinds of knowledge from them as well. So I think I do like the idea of getting outside of the large scale of the university, although it's still a place that has a lot of money and a lot of people, and it's still our job, I guess, you know. So it seems like a both kind of situation.
I've also had a similar situation with the TA, and I think it was actually due to probably cutbacks in the department, but the TA didn't actually have an office 2 semesters in a row, and so she was forced to hold her office hours off of the facilities. And I think it was actually the most productive kind of exchange that she would just go and sit in a coffee shop or a restaurant, and she would just kind of let you know where she was going to hang out that week, and then you could go and find her. And sometimes it was near the campus, and sometimes it wasn't. It would just be she'd be downtown, and the class was on Burnaby. So I think though those places aren't necessarily neutral, and they have their own maybe their own problems or their own tensions. Maybe they also work as an alternative.
I was just going to let you guys all maybe close off if you had anything to say. I'll start on the far end, and Jerry, you'll get the last word, of course. So, Nicholas, if you wanted to.
To add a problem and just kind of like something that I've been carrying with me for a few years, and why it is that I pulled out this sort of ramble that I did. They did a study, the psychology departments at the University of Guelph and University of Alabama, that, and I've used this in a couple of my own papers, where they are basically testing undergraduate students to see their knowledge about large global issues, their concern for large global issues, and then their belief in people in power to take care of those large global issues, and how those 3 categories combine with one another and relate to one another. It is the opposite of what you want to hear. If a person feels like they don't know anything about environmental change or the economic collapse, or let's say environmental collapse or the economic change, perhaps, is a more accurate way to talk about it, then they will be less likely to be concerned about it. If they are highly concerned about it, they will be more likely to believe that someone in power is going to take care of it, and less likely to want to learn more. And so in every way that it's online, it's openable, and it's quite, it puts forward a challenge as a teacher pedagogically. And so for me, this is just to reiterate why I say I think the biggest thing that I can give to my students right now when I'm in the classroom is to overcome that and let them know that it's okay to be incoherent, and that it's not something that you can account for in the level of yourself, and we need to be honest about what's happening. So that's the background for my talk.
To respond to what Jeff said, I've been recently looking at a lot of pedagogy and reading a lot of 70s literature around it, looking at John Dewey and Robert Filiou and so on, a lot focused on the arts. And what really strikes me in all of it is the word environment. They come back to this idea of creating an environment that functions, environment. But they never define that environment in a very practical and structural way. They never give a floor plan. They never tell you which environment are you using. And so I think that the question of space is fundamental, especially in the sort of new universities, and I'm talking in relation to Canada, that have sort of sprung up in urban centers and that leave very little space for environment or the creation of an environment. And this, relating to what Jerry had to say, is this idea of this school as a box with seats facing forward. How do we challenge that? How do we push that? I think the frustration is that somewhere like Arthur Erickson's building at SFU actually allowed for congregation. There is an open agora. There is a space for students to join. But the new universities, like this university, do not have that. They've completely squeezed that out. And so the tactics have to change. But I do think that a lot of the issues, whether it be issues of any of the issues I listed, and poor pedagogy, not a feeling of belonging, alienation, are at the root a space problem. Can you create an environment where people feel like they belong? Can you create an environment where people can take agency? Can you create an environment where the division between faculty, direction, and students is not so clear and evident, where it actually is allowed to change? And I think that's something that's disappeared and needs to be brought back.
I don't know if I have any closing comments. I've been recently reading a book that's about pedagogy and education, that it's following a brief history of how artists, poets, thinkers, and critics are constantly trying to redesign or redevelop a new school. And I'm wondering if it's because they all went to schools for too long and and now need to reimagine it in some way. But that it's a constant state of focus, like they need to reinvent the art school or reinvent the philosophy of university. So I just think that's kind of an interesting thought to leave on. And I just want to say thank you for letting me be a part of this panel.
I think I might have a better response to Jeff's question maybe, but also something that I could end on, just which is that the idea maybe of radical pedagogy might be somewhat simple in that if we just stop focusing so much on the designated space of learning in the university and view every social interaction and moment of social relating as an instance of change in knowledge production, that in itself is a decolonizing act, as well as an anti-capitalist act, as well as a radical pedagogy as well. And I guess I'll end there.
That's good. That's good.
Just 3 points. I had to think about the architecture and living with Erickson's architecture since 1965, and the thought that occurred to me apropos of Jeff's intervention was where egoistic architecture is, there shall repression be. That's a paraphrase of Freud, where ego is, there shall autonomy be. In other words, it disguises class conflict. It disguises the materials around its illusory construction and recapturing the idea of a modernizing past. Okay, now what am I saying with that? My disillusionment with the panel about Muntadas's show was that I had hoped in the argument between the academy and the university, which was something I tried to get at in my comments as loose. They're not loose. There was a story there. But to take it back to my own experience and my own turning point, right, and that universities are places both for faculty, students, and unfortunately not administrators until they retire and write lies, but that they are turning points, and they are experiential. That is informed by material space. I think what Jeff has pointed out insightfully is that universities are not just ideas; they're material space, and material space is ideological space, right? And it's by definition conflicted space, made up of many different kinds of publics. So if we just translate all that into community without recognizing the roots of different kinds of publics historically that come into the university, then we've just done everything that the melting pot concept wants us to do without making really, clear discrimination about where the ideological positions are. Sometimes they're class, sometimes they're not. That's so I wanted to say that. Thank you. Thanks for everybody.
Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you very much, Jerry.